Hello BookTube, my name is Juan. I am just one reader, your favorite Mexican booktuber, here with a Friday Reads video. I have so many great books to share with you. Hopefully you will find something interesting in this video. So let's just dive right in. The first book that I completed this week was Neil Gaiman's collection of nonfiction, The View from the Cheap Seats. I really enjoyed this book, especially the parts where he talks about some other authors or some books. Specifically, he talks about The 13 Clocks by James Thurber, which is a fantastic book that I adore. And he just talks so kindly and warmly. There's something about Neil Gaiman's voice in this particular book that is so human and decent and just absolutely brilliant and wise, but just so endearing. I really loved this book. The only reason why I decided to give it 4 stars instead of 5 was that there's a big chunk, a big section of this book where he talks about things that I don't really know or care that much about, like comic books and stuff like that, or certain authors that I'm not really all that familiar with or don't have any interest in. So there were some articles and little things in here that were not as interesting to me, but the things that I really liked about this book, I adored. So this is a very interesting collection of nonfiction. If you want something about books and reading and writing and the connection that we as readers and humans in general can connect, how we connect to words and language, this is a really interesting piece. So 4 stars. Then I completed another book that was a failure. It was not a good book. This is a book called The King of Buffys by Tanya Kinkel. This is a book set in the universe of The Never-Ending Story, which happens to be my favorite book of all time. This is kind of like a spin-off novel by a different author, but set in the same universe of Fantasia from The Never-Ending Story. What I was expecting from this book was, I was expecting to go back into the world of Fantasia, but explore more of the world and to have just a different story, a different tale set within this universe. Instead, what I got was a little bit of that, but then the second half of the book, it was just like retreading the never-ending story all over again, like the same conflict. We need a savior, someone who will come to Fantasia and destroy the nothing and restore Fantasia to its prime and give the childlike empress another name, a new name. So it was sort of retreading the footsteps of the never-ending story by the end, and it just became the never-ending story all over again, and it was not enjoyable in that regard. I did like the beginning of the book though. The beginning of the book was very fresh, very original, very interesting world, nice premise, but then it just sort of became the never-ending story 2.0, just from another angle, and I was very disappointed. It was not a compelling story, honestly. And another thing that I didn't really like about this book was that there was only really one character to follow, the main character. The rest of the characters, I think the side characters, there was just too many of them. There was too many of them, and also they didn't really have any flavor or personality. They were just little quirky characters, but I just didn't connect with this book, and the plot itself was not rewarding at all. So I only gave it 2 stars because I think there is a compelling premise and a compelling beginning to this book, but then it just sort of fell apart. So I would not recommend it. So that's what I finished reading this week. And then I started reading two books that I am reading simultaneously. I think they complement each other rather nicely, surprisingly. And I am enjoying both of them very much for different reasons. And those are The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams and The Philosopher's Stone by J.K. Rowling. So they actually complement each other quite nicely, which is a very interesting surprise. So let's talk about The Dragonbone Chair first. The Dragonbone Chair by Tad Williams is the beginning, the introduction to a fantasy trilogy, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. So there's a lot of introducing the characters, introducing the world, introducing the history of the world, introducing the lore. So there's a lot of world building going on at first, and it can be a little tiresome, but I'm not getting overly frustrated by that. I'm really liking it. I'm really enjoying the beginning of the book, especially. I am right now on page 150, so I'm getting there. And it's really interesting. It's a high fantasy world. You can see that there's a lot of history that Tad Williams has sort of created as a backstory to this. I really like the main character, Simon. He's a 14-year-old boy who actually feels like a 14-year-old boy. I am really, really liking this character. There's a lot of other interesting side characters as well. I honestly don't really know where the story might go. I have no idea what the trilogy is about. I'm just sort of going in blindly, but I really enjoy it. I think the writing style can be a little hard to get into, but once you do get into it, you can't stop. It becomes very readable, very unput-downable, even though there's not a lot of action. You really get immersed in this writing style. I think it has a lot of flow to it. So I will be reading this probably for a week and a half more. And then, of course, the other book that I am reading is Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I decided to read this book celebrating Harry Potter International Day, which is this Sunday, July 31st, which is Harry Potter's birthday and J.K. Rowling's birthday as well. So, of course, I need to celebrate Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. I always do. It's a ritual that I do every year. On this time of year, I always read Harry Potter or do something to celebrate Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling. And rereading this book for the 30th time or something, it's so delightful. It's so easy to read, of course. I know the book by heart. It's such a tiny little middle grade novel, but it's done so well. And let me tell you, I have read many middle grade books. I have read a lot of fantasy. I don't consider myself an expert of fantasy as a genre, but I have read my fair share. And J.K. Rowling just has something else, something unique, something special that many people wish they had. I mean, Brandon Sanderson, for all of his world building and all of his creativity and whatnot, he wishes he could have just an ounce of J.K. Rowling's liveliness in her writing. There's just something alive in her writing. I particularly enjoy right now in this reread how well she does voices, characters' voices. Hermione and Ron especially, I am noticing they have a very specific way of delivering dialogue. You can immediately know when it's Hermione or Ron or Malfoy talking. There's just something about the prosody, the prosodial rhythm in their speech pattern that is so spot on perfect. Like, these are real people to me. Something else that I really love is how you can really see the influences of Charles Dickens or Roald Dahl in her writing. There's just a very marked Dickensian vibe to it, but also such a light-hearted warmth. And there's a lot of humor in this book. It's absolutely ludicrously funny. Like, there is a joke. There's a joke that I read this morning. I was howling with laughter. And, you know, something else that I am enjoying in this reread is coming back to the original Harry Potter. Before Harry Potter was the worldwide phenomenon that it became later on and that it is now, with theme parks and Hollywood blockbuster movies and merchandising and spin-off movies, which are terrible. But before we got all of that nonsense, I remember reading this book for the first time when I actually I'm gonna flip the camera. Oh, I can't flip the camera right now because it's already recording. Anyway, I'm gonna just take this and show you right there in that garden. That's where I read this book for the first time 24 years ago. 24 years ago, little Juan was sitting there in that garden reading this book for the first time in Spanish, of course, because I was 6 or 7. And I was reading this book in Spanish because my parents had kind of forced me to read this because everyone else was reading it. And my parents really wanted me to develop the habit of reading because I wasn't interested in reading at all. And I was like complacent and I said, okay, I'll do it. They got me a copy of this book in Spanish and I started reading it right there in that garden 24 years ago. And the rest is history, man. I get kind of emotional and yeah, I get very emotional thinking of that time before Harry Potter was what it became later on. It was very hard to imagine Hogwarts or, I don't know, platform 9 3/4. I'd never been to a train station. I couldn't imagine London. I couldn't imagine a train station in London or all of these places that are discussed in this book. It was very hard for me to imagine, but that kind of spark of imagination that this book conjured up in me when I was 6 or 7, I still remember that. I still remember imagining all of these characters and places and things before we got the movies and all of that. And that's the Harry Potter that I love. That's the Harry Potter that I always keep coming back to. The Harry Potter that existed in my mind, in my fantasy, in my imagination, before it blew up and became the phenomenon that it later on became. So I'm just thinking a lot about that Harry Potter. And I'm getting very emotional reading this book now. So anyway, that's what I am reading this weekend. Let me know in the comments down below. What are you reading? What do you think of these books? And I will see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.